Ava Carter stepped into the towering Blackwood Enterprises building, her heart pounding against her ribs as she adjusted the strap of her worn-out handbag. The glass walls and sleek marble floors screamed luxury, a world far removed from her own. She had dreamt of this opportunity for years, but now that she was here, an unsettling nervousness gnawed at her confidence. She clutched her resume, already aware of the whispers around her. The employees, women in sharp pencil skirts and men in tailored suits, cast lingering glances her way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. Her modest attire made her stand out in a place where wealth was woven into the very fabric of the people walking these halls. She didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. "Miss Carter?" A crisp, professional voice broke her thoughts. She turned to see a woman with cold, calculating eyes and an expression that suggested she had better things to do than deal with a newcomer. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now." Ava nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat as she followed the woman down a long hallway. With every step, she could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. This job meant everything. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was survival. She had bills to pay, a sick mother to care for, and dreams that had been crushed too many times for her to give up now. When the woman finally stopped in front of a large, imposing door, she turned to Ava, her lips pressed into a thin line. "A word of advice," she said coolly. "Mr. Blackwood is difficult. He doesn't tolerate incompetence. You'll last a week if you're lucky." Ava's fingers tightened around the file in her hands, but she lifted her chin. She had faced worse. She wasn't going to break now. The door swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ethan Blackwood sat behind a massive desk, his dark eyes scanning through files, barely acknowledging her presence. He was everything the rumors said: tall, intimidating, and sharp-edged like a man carved from stone. He didn't look up. "You're late." Ava blinked, her pulse quickening. "I was told my appointment was at 10. "It was. It's 10:02. His voice was void of emotion, a blade slicing through the air. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to remain composed. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood. It won't happen again." "Good, because I don't believe in second chances." Finally, he lifted his gaze, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Ava obeyed, sitting up straight as she placed her resume in front of him. Ethan picked it up, scanning through the pages with bored indifference. "You graduated with honors, impressive, yet you've had only minor secretarial jobs in small firms. Why should I hire you?" She swallowed hard, knowing this was her one shot. "Because I don't give up. I learn fast, work hard, and I don't stop until I get things right. I know I may not fit into this world, but I promise you, Mr. Blackwood, I will prove myself." Silence stretched between them. His expression remained unreadable, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden desk. Finally, he leaned back, his sharp gaze dissecting her as though he were searching for weakness. "You're persistent. That's rare. But persistence means nothing without results." He dropped her resume on the table. "You have a 1-week trial. Fail, and you're out." Ava exhaled slowly. "I won't fail." Ethan's lips twitched, not a smile, not approval, just a ghost of amusement that disappeared before she could be sure she had seen it. "We'll see about that." The next few days were nothing short of brutal. Ava barely had time to breathe. Ethan was relentless, throwing tasks at her faster than she could process. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were laced with criticism. "Too slow. Fix this, or don't bother coming back tomorrow. If you can't handle pressure, leave now." She wanted to scream, to walk out and never look back. But every time frustration threatened to consume her, she reminded herself why she was here. She wasn't just fighting for a job, she was fighting for her family, for a future where she wouldn't have to choose between buying medicine for her mother or paying rent. One evening, after an exhausting 12-hour shift, she caught Ethan watching her. It wasn't the usual cold, assessing gaze. There was something else, something softer. But the moment their eyes met, his expression hardened, and he turned away as if angry at himself for looking. That night, as she packed up her things, the receptionist smirked at her. "You're still here? Most secretaries don't last this long." Ava lifted her chin. "I'm not like most secretaries." The woman's smirk faded. "No, you're not. That's why you should be careful." Ethan Blackwood? He doesn't get close to people, and when he does... She leaned in slightly. It never ends well for them. Ava didn't sleep that night. What had she gotten herself into? Over the next week, something shifted. Ethan still criticized her, but there were moments, tiny glimpses where he almost seemed concerned, like when she forgot to eat lunch and an extra meal appeared on her desk. No note, no explanation. Or when she nearly collapsed from exhaustion and he muttered something about not wanting incompetence due to malnutrition, before walking away without looking back. Then came the stormy evening that changed everything. The office was almost empty when thunder rumbled outside. Ava was filing reports when she heard a sound, deep, frustrated sigh. She turned to see Ethan standing by the window, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. He looked troubled. She hesitated before speaking. "Is everything okay, Mr. Blackwood?" He didn't turn. "It doesn't concern you." Most people would have left, but Ava wasn't most people. She took a careful step forward. Sometimes talking helps. For a moment, she thought he would ignore her. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "People think power solves everything. It doesn't. It just makes the fall harder." Ava's breath hitched. There was something raw in his voice, something that didn't belong to the untouchable billionaire everyone feared. Before she could respond, he turned to her, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "Go home, Ava." "But I still have." "Now." His voice was low, almost gentle. She nodded, grabbing her things, but as she walked past him, she felt it, the weight of his gaze lingering on her. That night, as the storm raged outside, Ava realized something terrifying. She wasn't just surviving Blackwood Enterprises anymore. She was getting entangled in Ethan Blackwood's world. And worse, she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. Ava Carter had barely caught her breath after the relentless workload Ethan Blackwood had thrown at her when she received an unexpected call from his assistant. The voice on the other end was cold, professional, and completely indifferent to the fact that she was barely managing to keep up with her demanding job. "Pack your bags, Miss Carter," the assistant had instructed. "You're leaving for France in 4 hours." Ava's heart nearly stopped. "What? Why?" she asked, gripping the phone tighter. "Mr. Blackwood will brief you on the way," the woman said curtly. "Be at the airport. Do not be late." The line went dead. No explanation, no choice. Just an order she had to follow. She rushed home, stuffing whatever professional outfits she could into a small suitcase. Her hands trembled as she zipped it shut. She had no idea why Ethan was taking her on a business trip, but she wasn't in a position to refuse. This job was all she had. Her mother's hospital bills, her rent, everything depended on it. And if she had learned anything about Ethan Blackwood, it was that he did not tolerate disobedience. By the time she reached the airport, she was breathless, her mind racing. Ethan was already there, dressed in his usual flawless dark suit, his face unreadable as he checked his watch. "You're late," he said, his tone as sharp as a blade. Ava exhaled, trying to steady herself. "It's 2 minutes past the time you gave me," she countered. Ethan's gaze flickered to her, a hint of amusement in his eyes before it quickly vanished. "2 minutes is enough to lose a deal," he replied coldly, before turning toward the jet. "Let's go." Ava followed, unsure of what she had just walked into. The flight was quiet, tense. Ethan worked on his laptop the entire time, barely sparing her a glance. It wasn't until they were 30 minutes from landing that he finally closed his laptop and looked at her. "The Montreux International deal is important," he stated. "These investors value family, stability. They don't believe in power without responsibility." Ava frowned, confused. "Okay, and what does that have to do with me?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "There's a rumor circulating." She tilted her head. "What kind of rumor?" "That you're my mistress," he said bluntly. Ava's mouth fell open. Her pulse spiked. "Excuse me." Ethan didn't flinch. "Someone leaked photos of us traveling together. The investors assume we're romantically involved." Ava could barely process what he was saying. "That's insane. Why would they think that?" Ethan's expression remained unreadable. Because in their world, women don't work closely with men unless there's something more involved. Her stomach twisted with anger. "That's ridiculous." "Perhaps," Ethan said smoothly. "But their perception is what matters, not the truth. And now they're hesitant to finalize the deal. They won't sign unless I prove that I'm a man who values stability." Ava narrowed her eyes. So, what do you plan to do? Release a statement? Ethan leaned back, watching her carefully. No, we're getting married. Ava's breath hitched. What? A contract marriage, he clarified. 6 months. We present ourselves as a married couple, secure the deal, and then dissolve the arrangement. Ava laughed short, humorless sound. You're joking. Ethan's face remained cold, unmoved. Do I look like I'm joking? She stared at him, searching his eyes for any sign that this was some kind of twisted test. But there was nothing, just calculated determination. You're insane, she whispered. Ethan's jaw clenched slightly. I don't have time for debate. The investors need to see stability, and you need the money. Ava froze. You need financial security, he continued, his voice quieter now. Your mother's medical bills, your unpaid rent. This contract benefits both of us. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him principles, morals, and self-respect, but his words cut through her defenses like a knife. He wasn't wrong. She was drowning under the weight of responsibilities, and this contract marriage, it could solve everything, but at what cost? She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can do this. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. You can, and you will. Ava exhaled shakily, looking away. She had always believed that love was something sacred, something that couldn't be bought, sold, or faked. And yet, here she was, about to sign herself into a marriage that wasn't real. Fine, she finally whispered. I'll do it. Ethan didn't smile. He simply nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. Good. We'll sign the contract when we land. The next few hours passed in a blur. They went straight from the airport to a private courthouse where a discreet judge officiated the ceremony. It was cold, clinical, emotionless, just a transaction between two people who needed something from each other. Do you, Ethan Blackwood, take Ava Carter to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was steady, detached. And do you, Ava Carter, take Ethan Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband? Ava swallowed the lump in her throat. I do. The judge smiled. Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ava barely had time to process what had just happened before Ethan turned to her. It's done, he said simply. Let's go. She followed him out of the courthouse, her legs feeling like lead. Just hours ago, she had been his employee. Now she was his wife. That night, they attended the investor gala as husband and wife. Ava could feel the weight of every state, every whisper. But Ethan played his role perfectly, keeping her close, his hand firm on her waist as he spoke to the guests. How long have you two been married? One of the investors asked. Not long, Ethan answered smoothly. But when you know, you know. Ava forced a smile, but inside, she felt like she was standing on a crumbling ledge. As the evening wore on, Ethan's grip on her waist tightened whenever someone got too close. When an older investor attempted to flirt with her, Ethan's jaw twitched, and he pulled her closer, his voice low, dangerous. She's my wife, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The investor backed away, laughing nervously. Ava glanced up at Ethan, her heart hammering. You didn't have to do that, she murmured. Ethan looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Yes, I did. For a moment, she forgot this was all fake. That night, as they walked back to the hotel, neither spoke. But as they stepped into the elevator, Ethan finally broke the silence. You did well tonight, he said. Ava turned to him, searching his face. So did you. He smirked slightly, but there was something tired, almost vulnerable behind it. She hesitated before asking, Do you regret this? Ethan exhaled, leaning against the elevator wall. Regret is for people who have choices. Ava's chest tightened. She had signed up for 6 months. No more, no less. But something deep inside her whispered that nothing about this arrangement would go according to plan. The first few weeks of their contract marriage were exactly what Ava had expected, cold, calculated, and transactional. Ethan Blackwood maintained his distance, treating their arrangement as nothing more than a business deal, and Ava followed suit, keeping things strictly professional. They attended corporate events together, played the role of a perfectly poised couple, and then retreated to separate rooms in the grand penthouse Ethan had arranged for them. But things began to change. It started with small moments, glimpses of a man hidden behind the ruthless billionaire. One evening, Ava had been working late in the study, going through stacks of paperwork for Ethan's upcoming meetings. She hadn't noticed the time until she felt a sharp pang in her stomach. She sighed, realizing she hadn't eaten since lunch. "You work like an idiot." Ethan's voice startled her. She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his usual disapproving gaze fixed on her. Ava blinked. "Excuse me? You skip meals, you overwork yourself, and then you wonder why you're exhausted," he said, tossing a takeout bag onto the desk in front of her. She frowned. "What's this?" "Dinner." She stared at him, surprised. "You brought me food?" Ethan scoffed, looking away. "I don't need my secretary passing out in the middle of a meeting." Ava bit back a smile. "Of course, wouldn't want that." But deep inside, she knew. This wasn't about business. The more time they spent together, the more Ava saw cracks in Ethan's walls. He wasn't just a cold-hearted CEO, there was something broken, something wounded deep inside him. One night, she found him in the library, sitting in the dim glow of the fireplace, an expensive glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked lost, staring into the flames as if trapped in a memory. She hesitated before stepping forward. "Ethan?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost distant. "Do you believe in fate, Ava?" She frowned, taken aback by the question. "I don't know. Why?" He let out a hollow chuckle. "Because I used to, until I realized fate has a twisted sense of humor." Ava slowly sat across from him. "What happened?" Ethan swirled his whiskey, his gaze dark. "My father was a powerful man, cold, ruthless. He only cared about money and control. When my mother tried to leave him, he destroyed her, took everything from her, forced her to stay, trapped in a loveless marriage." He exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the glass. "She died miserable, and I swore I'd never become him." Ava's heart clenched. She had never seen Ethan like this, unguarded, vulnerable. "But here I am," he continued bitterly, "trapped in a marriage that isn't real, just like he was." Ava's breath caught. Was that how he saw her? Just another forced responsibility? She wanted to tell him that they weren't the same, that whatever was happening between them was different, but the words never came. Instead, she reached out, hesitating before placing a hand over his. "You're not your father, Ethan." He flinched slightly at the touch, as if human connection was foreign to him. But he didn't pull away. His gaze met hers, something raw flickering in his dark eyes. For a brief moment, the air between them shifted. But then, just as quickly, he pulled his hand back, his walls snapping up again. "It's late," he muttered, standing abruptly. "You should go to bed." Ava nodded slowly, watching as he walked away, his posture stiff, as if he was running from something he couldn't escape. But the distance between them wouldn't last. One night, during a charity gala, things took an unexpected turn. Ava had been mingling with the guests, her fake smile perfectly in place, when she overheard two women whispering nearby. "Did you hear? Ethan's wife used to be his secretary. Can you imagine?" Of course, he probably bought her like he does everything else. Ava's face burned. But before she could say anything, a hand wrapped around her waist. Ethan. His grip was firm, his expression unreadable as he pulled her closer, his lips grazing her ear. "Ignore them," he murmured, his voice dark. Ava forced a smile, but her heart pounded. "They think I'm a gold digger." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They're idiots." She exhaled shakily. "And what do you think?" For a moment, something flashed in his eyes. Then, before she could process it, he did something completely unexpected. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her, slight, barely there, yet electrifying. Ava's breath hitched, the world around them blurred. When he pulled away, his voice was softer, almost dangerous. "I think you should stop doubting your worth." Ava couldn't sleep that night. That kiss, it had been for show, hadn't it? But deep inside, she knew. It didn't feel fake. The tension between them grew unbearable after that. Every glance lingered too long. Every accidental touch sent sparks through her veins. One evening, during a storm, the power in the penthouse went out. Ava had been reading when the light suddenly flickered off, plunging the room into darkness. She gasped, her heart racing. Footsteps approached. Then a hand brushed against hers. "It's just a storm." Ethan's voice was low, reassuring. Ava swallowed hard. "I hate the dark." He hesitated before speaking again. "Come here." She didn't think she just moved. Ethan pulled her against him, his warmth steady, grounding. For the first time she felt safe. "You're shaking," he murmured. Ava forced a chuckle. "I guess I'm not as fearless as you." Ethan was silent for a moment before whispering, "You're stronger than you think?" Ava looked up, and in that instant, something changed. She saw it the way he looked at her, like she was something precious. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. Then, just as suddenly, Ethan pulled away, his expression shutting down. "This whatever this is, it's not real." His voice was cold, but there was an edge to it, like he was trying to convince himself. Ava's chest tightened. "Right?" she murmured, forcing herself to step back, but deep inside she knew. This wasn't just a contract anymore, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Ava had felt it coming, the shift in the air, the weight of an unseen storm looming over her fragile world. For weeks, she had ignored the unease crawling up her spine, convincing herself that she and Ethan could exist in their own reality, separate from the ruthless world he belonged to. But she had been wrong. Very wrong. The first sign came in the form of a phone call. She was in the penthouse kitchen, stirring a cup of coffee when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the unknown number, hesitated, then picked up. A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the silence. "You should know when to leave before it's too late, dear." Ava's fingers tightened around the cup. "Who is this?" A soft chuckle. Elegant, but chilling. "That's not important. What matters is that you don't belong in Ethan Blackwood's world. You never will." The line went dead before she could respond. Ava's hands trembled as she set the cup down. Her mind raced. It could be a cruel prank, a jealous socialite from one of the galas, but something deep inside her whispered that this was bigger than gossip. This was a warning. She forced herself to shake it off. She wouldn't let fear rule her. Ethan had chosen her for this arrangement, and if she was going to play her part, she had to be strong. But then came the second sign. She arrived at the office one morning to find her desk empty. Every document, every file she had been working on gone. The whispers started immediately. Did she get fired? Maybe she wasn't qualified for the job after all. I heard Mr. Blackwood's mother wasn't happy about their marriage. Ava's stomach churned. She stormed into Ethan's office, slamming the door behind her. "Did you take me off the project?" Ethan looked up from his paperwork, frowning. "What are you talking about? My files. They're gone. My access was revoked. Everyone's acting like I'm already out of a job." Ethan's eyes darkened. "I didn't do that." He picked up the phone and dialed. "Get IT on the line." Now Ava watched as his jaw tightened, his entire body going rigid. Someone was pulling the strings, trying to erase her. And deep down, she already knew who it was. The third and final sign came later that evening. She returned to the penthouse, exhausted and drained, only to find a woman sitting in the living room, her posture poised and regal, a glass of wine in her manicured fingers. The sight sent a cold shiver down Ava's spine. Victoria Blackwood, the infamous matriarch of the Blackwood Empire. The woman who controlled fortunes, destroyed reputations, and had built an empire alongside her late husband. Ava's throat went dry. So this is where the storm finally breaks. Victoria lifted her gaze, assessing her with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, you're home. I was wondering how long it would take you to arrive." Ava forced herself to stay calm. "Mrs. Blackwood," she greeted cautiously. "I wasn't expecting a visit." Victoria swirled the wine in her glass. "No, I imagine you weren't." Ava didn't sit. She knew better than to get comfortable in front of a woman who had come to destroy her. "What can I do for you?" Victoria studied her for a long moment, then sighed as if bored. "You're quite pretty, I'll give you that. A little rough around the edges, but I suppose Ethan has always been drawn to projects." Ava stiffened. "I'm not a project." Victoria smirked. "Oh, my dear, you're exactly that. A distraction. A phase. Something temporary before he comes to his senses." Ava's heart pounded, but she refused to let her fear show. "He married me." Victoria set down her glass, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Yes, he did. And it was quite a clever little game, wasn't it? The contract, the act, the charade of a loving wife standing by his side." She tilted her head. "Did you think it would become real? That he would choose you over the Blackwood name?" Ava's breath hitched. Victoria smiled, seeing the hesitation in her eyes. "You don't belong here, Ava. You never did. And I'm here to ensure you don't make the mistake of believing otherwise." Ava clenched her fists. "Ethan is a grown man. He makes his own choices." Victoria's expression didn't change. "Do you love him?" The question was a slap to her chest. Ava faltered. "Because he does not love you." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice like velvet laced with poison. Ethan was trained to be powerful, not sentimental. He will never love you the way you hope he will. He will never choose you over this empire. Ava felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. Victoria stood, smoothing out her silk dress. Walk away now, while you still have your dignity. Because if you don't, I will ensure that you leave one way or another. Ava's voice was barely a whisper. You're threatening me. Victoria smiled. No, darling, I'm warning you. Ava wanted to scream, to fight, to tell Victoria that she was wrong, that Ethan wasn't his mother's puppet. But her mind replayed every moment between them, the way he always held back, the way he pushed her away whenever things became too real. Maybe Victoria was right. Maybe this was just a game to him. Ava swallowed the lump in her throat. You think I'm weak, don't you? Victoria chuckled. Oh no, I think you're naive. There's a difference. Ava turned away, trying to steady her breath. She had spent her whole life fighting to survive, but this was a battle she couldn't win. The next morning, she made her decision. She packed her bags in silence, her hands trembling as she zipped the last suitcase shut. She placed her wedding ring on the nightstand, staring at it for a long moment. She had loved him. Maybe he had loved her in his own twisted, conflicted way. But love wasn't enough, not when she would always be second to power. She left a letter on his desk. Ethan, this was never meant to last, and we both knew it. I won't be the reason you lose everything you worked for. And I won't be the woman who waits for a love that will never come. Goodbye, Ava. Then she walked away. She didn't look back, not even when she heard Ethan's voice calling her name. Ethan Blackwood had faced ruthless competitors, survived corporate wars, and built an empire from the ashes of his father's legacy. But nothing had ever shaken him like this. The moment he stepped into his penthouse and saw Ava's suitcase missing, a cold, suffocating panic gripped his chest. His sharp gaze scanned the room. Her clothes were gone, her scent was fading, and worst of all, her wedding ring lay abandoned on the nightstand. Ava was gone. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he stepped closer to the nightstand, his hands clenched into fists. His gaze locked onto the small, folded note beside the ring. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked it up, unfolding the paper with the same dread as a man awaiting a death sentence. Ethan, this was never meant to last, and we both knew it. I won't be the reason you lose everything you worked for, and I won't be the woman who waits for a love that will never come. Goodbye. Ava. The words blurred in front of his eyes, but he forced himself to read them again, and again, until the reality of what she had done struck him like a blade straight to his chest. She thought she wasn't enough. She thought he wouldn't choose her. The rage came swiftly, burning through him like wildfire. He stormed out of the penthouse, his phone already in his hand. Where is she? He barked into the receiver, his voice dangerously low. His assistant stammered on the other end, clearly unprepared for Ethan's wrath. Sir, I believe she left for the airport. I don't know where she. Ethan hung up before the sentence could finish. She was running, but he wasn't going to let her go. He drove like a madman through the city, weaving through traffic at dangerous speeds. His mind replayed every moment, every silent plea in Ava's eyes, every time she had looked at him as if she was waiting for something more, something he had been too much of a coward to give her. By the time he reached the airport, his heart pounded like a war drum. He pushed through the crowd, his eyes searching, desperate, frantic. Then he saw her. Ava stood by the gate, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale, her eyes distant. She looked broken. Ethan didn't think, he acted. Ava, his voice was raw, sharp enough to cut through the noise of the airport. She stiffened. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she turned around. The moment her eyes met his, time seemed to stop. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos surrounding them. He took a step forward, then another. And then he was standing in front of her, breathless, furious, and completely undone. You were just gonna leave? His voice was low, but the pain in it was undeniable. Without saying anything to me? Ava swallowed hard. I left a note. A damn note? His hands clenched at his sides. That's what I meant to you? A goodbye letter and a ring on a nightstand? Tears welled in her eyes, but she held her ground. Ethan, I had to. Your mother is not my future, he interrupted, his tone hard. You are. Ava flinched. No, Ethan, I'm a distraction, a phase. I heard her say it. You'll never choose me over Blackwood Enterprises. A muscle in his jaw ticked. You think I care about a name more than I care about you? I think it's all you've ever known, she said, her voice breaking. Ethan exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair in frustration. He had never been good with emotions, never been the kind of man who laid his soul bare for anyone. But for Ava, he had no choice. I love you, he said suddenly, his voice fierce. Ava's breath hitched. What? You heard me. He stepped closer, his eyes burning into hers. I love you, Ava, and I was a fool for not telling you sooner. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. Ethan, don't. I'm leaving Blackwood Enterprises, he cut her off, her eyes widened. What? I'm walking away, he said firmly. I'm done living under my mother's control. I'm done letting power dictate my happiness. Ava's heart pounded. But your company. I built that company, he said, his voice unshakable. I can build another. What I can't do is lose you. A choked sob escaped her lips. You'd give it all up? For me? Ethan reached for her, cupping her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. I'd give up the world for you, he whispered. For the first time, Ava saw it. The walls were gone. The fear, the hesitation, all of it had crumbled. And in its place was a man who had finally chosen love over power. Ava let out a soft, broken laugh, wrapping her arms around his neck. You really are the most stubborn man alive. Ethan smirked, pressing his forehead against hers. And you're just realizing this now? She laughed through her tears, shaking her head. I love you too, you idiot. Ethan didn't waste another second. He kissed her. Right there in the middle of the airport, in front of hundreds of people, in front of the flashing cameras of paparazzi who had followed him. And he didn't care. The next morning, the news had exploded. Ethan sat on the couch, Ava curled up beside him, her fingers laced with his as they watched the news unfold. He smirked. So how does it feel being the woman who made me abandon my billionaire lifestyle? Ava rolled her eyes, playfully shoving his shoulder. I didn't make you do anything. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. You made me realize what really matters. Later that evening, Ethan drove Ava to a quiet neighborhood far from the city, far from the toxic world of corporate power plays and business wars. She frowned as they pulled up to a charming white house with a wraparound porch. Ethan, where are we? He turned to her, his expression soft. Our new home. Ava's breath caught. What? I told you, he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'm starting over, and I want to do it with you. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the house, their house. This is real? She whispered. Ethan tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. This is forever. Ava let out a soft laugh, wiping at her tears. You really do love me, he smirked, pulling her into his arms. More than you'll ever know. And for the first time in her life, Ava Carter knew she had finally found her home. The sun was setting over the quiet countryside, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink as Ava sat on the porch of the house Ethan had bought for them. A gentle breeze played with her hair as she stared at the horizon, still trying to grasp the reality of everything that had happened. Ethan had walked away from his empire for her. It still didn't seem real. She had spent so much time believing she was just a temporary part of his life distraction, a contract, a means to an end. And yet here she was, in a home he had chosen for them, away from the toxic world of wealth and power he had once ruled. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Ethan stepping onto the porch, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. You've been quiet, he said, sitting beside her. Ava smiled slightly. I'm still processing everything. Ethan nodded, glancing at the horizon. I get it. It's a lot. He paused, then exhaled. Do you regret it? She turned to him, frowning. Regret what? Choosing this, choosing me. His voice was uncharacteristically hesitant, as if for the first time in his life, he was afraid of the answer. Ava's heart clenched. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. I don't regret anything, Ethan. I never did. His grip tightened around hers, as if grounding himself with her words, but there was something else in his eyes, something unspoken, as if he was holding back. Ava tilted her head. What is it? Ethan hesitated, then stood abruptly. Come with me? Curious, Ava followed him as he led her inside. They walked through the house, past the cozy living room and the sunlit kitchen, until he stopped in front of a door she hadn't seen before. He pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit study. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and in the center of the room was a sleek wooden desk with a stack of documents on top. Ava frowned. "What is this?" Ethan walked to the desk and picked up a file, handing it to her. "Read it." She opened it, her eyes scanning the bold letters on the first page. The Ava Carter Foundation. Her breath hitched. "Ethan, it's a foundation," he said quietly. "In your name. To help women from struggling backgrounds, women like you, who work hard but never get the chances they deserve." Ava's hands trembled as she turned the pages, reading about the mission, the funding, the outreach programs designed to help young women get education, jobs, and independence. It was everything she had ever wanted to do but never thought possible. She looked up at him, overwhelmed. "You did this for me?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I did this because I know what it's like to feel trapped by circumstances you didn't choose. And because I know you, Ava. I know how much you care about giving people a chance. You helped me see the world differently, and I wanted to give you something that wasn't just about us, but about the people you want to fight for." Tears pricked at her eyes. "Ethan, this is unbelievable." His lips curved into a faint smirk. "That's not all." Ava blinked in surprise as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her heart stopped. Ethan opened it, revealing a simple yet stunning diamond ring. Nothing flashy, nothing over the top, just perfect. Ava sucked in a breath. "Ethan." He stepped closer, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "No contracts, no business deals, just us." He exhaled, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "Ava, I love you. I don't know when it happened, I don't know how, but I know that without you, none of this means anything. You've always been more than just a part of my life. You became the reason I wanted something more than power and wealth. I didn't know what love was before you, but I know now." A tear slipped down Ava's cheek, and Ethan reached up, gently wiping it away with his thumb. "I want to build a life with you, Ava," he continued, his voice raw. "Not as part of a contract, not as a deal. Just because I can't imagine a future without you in it." Ava's breath shuddered. She had dreamed of hearing these words, but now that they were real, she could barely hold herself together. Ethan bent down on one knee, the powerful billionaire who once ruled boardrooms now kneeling before the woman he had given up everything for. "Marry me," he whispered. "For real this time." Ava let out a soft, broken laugh, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. "You idiot," Ethan smirked. "I'll take that as a yes," she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she threw her arms around him, pressing her lips against his. It wasn't like the first kiss they had shared, the one that had been part of an act, for the sake of business. This was real. This was everything. Ethan deepened the kiss, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her against him, as if he would never let her go again. When they finally broke apart, Ava laughed softly, looking down at the ring now on her finger. "I guess I'm stuck with you now." Ethan smirked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. For eternity, and for the first time in her life, Ava knew she was exactly where she belonged. There were no contracts, no conditions, no expectations, just love. And that was enough.